So, I saw an interesting headline recently. Rather, an interesting word in a headline. It said, a shift to clean energy would halt Russia's petrol thuggery and more. Petrol thuggery is the keyword here. I've never heard a cooler word than petrol thuggery, and it's definitely not a compound word I'd expected to see in a news headline. Today we're gonna get political. We're gonna talk about what's going on in Russia and Ukraine that's making waves in the news, and what it means for climate change. Hello, fellow peacemakers. Welcome back to episode 50 of Make Peace Not Beef. Holy crap. We are 50 episodes in. I just picture myself having talked for like 50 episodes. That is really hard to fathom. Anyway, this is quite the milestone. We are here, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, I was actually contemplating on doing a special episode where I would react to a bunch of vegan memes and then analyze the shit out of it just for fun, you know? Something a little bit more lighthearted to kind of just celebrate. But then the news of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the name of quote-unquote denazification took the internet by the storm, and it is impossible to ignore at this point. This is a rapidly developing conflict on the international stage that is getting coverage by the hour. There's journalists and activists on the ground right now protesting in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, which is under siege, and over 500,000 refugees have fled Ukraine. More than 350 civilians in Ukraine have been killed to date. So, what exactly is going on in Ukraine right now? I kind of want to dive into that and dissect that in today's episode because it's an important issue. But also, I want to talk about what it means for global oil and gas trade, and more broadly, how does it impact climate change? Well, at this point, all climate news is drowned out by all the reports on Ukraine. But if you didn't know, recently, the IPCC actually published their second part of their sixth assessment, which focuses on the impact of climate change, risk, and adaptations. Remember how they published part 1 back in August 2021 that declared code red on humanity? Yeah, so this is the part 2 of that same report that just came out recently, but it was definitely overshadowed by news of Ukraine and Russia. So I also want to briefly discuss that, but more in the context of Ukraine and Russia and how that's affecting climate change. Now, disclaimer. My podcast is definitely not CNN or the New York Times, and I am definitely not a policy pundit. And this is not a news podcast. Even though I think at this point my voice can pass for a news anchor, I'm not going to guarantee an accurate and elaborate rundown of the news. I will provide you with necessary context, but there will be a lot of my personal take on the issue in relation to climate change. So just bear that in mind. Anyway, to start, I want to ask, how are you holding up these days? Not sure about you, but I've just been feeling overwhelmed since right around the beginning of January. And to be precise, extremely stressed. For the most part, it's things going on in my personal life. You know, family affairs, rearranging my living situation, and then mostly just preparing for grad school. But no, not really preparing. Mostly just a lot of rumination. You know, wondering what it's like to live in Boston and how the hell I'm gonna pass all these crazy hard courses and make friends in a foreign environment when I have established my circles in Toronto and this is where my family and friends are. Just wondering how incredibly lonely I'm going to feel when I move over there. And then on top of that, I've just been doing a lot of research and networking with professionals for future career opportunities. And then there's this podcast, right? I can't just ignore it. I have to plan for content. And don't get me wrong, I'm very excited to hop on the mic every week, but recently kind of just going through a dip. And then it's like compounded by all that's going on a global level, namely the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And then of course, climate change being an ongoing issue. Blah. It's just a lot. And I am only human, so my method of escapism, you're gonna laugh. For the past month and a half or so, I've just been practically locking myself at home, just reading Margaret Atwood late at night, right before I go to sleep. Yep, terrible idea. While blasting Pink Floyd and Deep Purple on my speaker. Yep, I developed a newfound love for bands I overlooked in high school. They are excellent, by the way. All that is to say is that I've just been living in a hole, but not under a rock. So yes, I have been reading the news. And I've just been procrastinating on blowing off steam in the form of dystopian fiction and classic rock revival. Now, back to what we are going to focus on discussing for today, which is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And I will explain why it's relevant for this podcast in a bit. On February 21st, Russia orders attack on Ukraine in the name of peacekeeping forces. But really, it's a military deployment, and very soon Russian forces started launching missiles and artillery attacks on Ukrainian cities, with Kyiv being at the epicenter of the attack. So why did Russia all of a sudden invade Ukraine out of the blue? So it's actually not out of the blue. A bit of background. Russia has always had tense relations with Ukraine. Russia actually invaded Ukraine back in 2014, if you didn't remember, with the annexation of Crimea, when the Ukrainian government made joining NATO a priority back then. And for a while now, Russia has tried to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. For obvious reasons, right? Remember the Cold War? Russia's biggest fear is the expansion of NATO's influence into Eastern Europe to eventually encroach on Russian territory and its neighboring countries. And in recent years, Ukraine became a NATO partner. Though not a NATO member, it does enjoy some NATO protection and some benefits as a strategic partner. And the newly elected president of Ukraine, Zelensky, who was elected back in 2019, has been appealing to Biden about wanting Ukraine to join NATO for quite a while now. And there's been talks about asking the US to let Ukraine join NATO. And of course, this upset the Russian administration, which has attempted to subjugate Ukraine for years since its independence, since the Soviet Union disintegrated. Putin has long denied Ukraine's independence as a nation, meaning he does not recognize Ukraine as its own country, and he doesn't believe the Ukrainians are its own people. So the interesting thing is, in many ways, I actually find the Russia-Ukraine conflict to resemble the China-Taiwan conflict, which is very near and dear to me because, well, my background is Chinese. So I grew up hearing about the Taiwanese protesting against reunification and wanting to establish their independence. But I'm not going to get into East Asian politics today, so back to Russia. Even though the Russians claim that they're carrying out the attacks with surgical precision, but on the ground, civilians have suffered significant casualties. The airstrikes have targeted civilian destinations, including a maternity clinic and a TV tower in Kyiv, and some suspect this is the beginning of World War III. It's very intense right now. This is very clearly a proxy war between the United States and Russia, jostling for power in Eastern Europe. And Biden has announced that he will not be deploying troops to Ukraine and that he does not want US to be involved in this conflict. But the US has, in fact, sent Ukraine generous military aid, along with many other NATO countries such as UK and France, etc. Okay, so that's briefly the conflict. You can follow the news, but what I want to talk more about is Russia's history as a petrol state. So crude oil and gas form the basis of the Russian economy, right? Russia is an energy superpower with resources abound. It's incredibly rich in resources. It's the world's leading exporter of natural gas. And Russia actually provides almost 40% of the EU's natural gas and more than 25% of its crude oil. So it is a principal exporter of oil and gas, but not only to the European Union, also to the US. Almost 8% of the United States crude oil comes from Russia. Interestingly enough, despite the atrocities committed against Ukraine, the US did not sanction against oil trade with Russia, but Canada has. And of course, a country like US cannot simply put a sanction on Russian oil imports because, well, that's going to lead to broader long-term repercussions on the global oil market. And it's going to wreak economic havoc back home in the States as well. In fact, oil prices have already surged to a record 7-year high at $110 per barrel. And this is largely due to the Russia-Ukraine conflict-induced supply disruption fears. But also, for the past little while now, oil prices have been climbing, so it leads one to conjecture whether or not Russia timed the conflict sort of at the peak of oil prices. Who knows? What I want to argue today is that this could actually be very good news for the planet. How so? How is another global conflict good for the planet? The conflict in and of itself is not good for the planet. But because up until now, I think countries are finally slowly waking up to the fact that they must reduce reliance on Russian oil. And many countries are instead rapidly ramping up their renewable infrastructure in response to the conflict. In fact, the invasion of Ukraine is reshaping Germany's energy transition in a very positive way. So Germany has been historically heavily dependent on Russia for energy. And finally, this conflict has galvanized Germany to speed up its clean energy development. So Germany has pledged to become 100% renewable powered by 2035. And following the outbreak of the war, it put the Nord Stream 2 pipeline on hold as part of a key sanction against Russia. So that is rather good news on the climate front. Now, there is another piece of important update amid all of this. So the EU has banned 7 Russian banks from SWIFT, a key global payment system. I'm pretty sure most of you have heard of SWIFT at some point in your life, right? If you have ever transferred money across the borders, you must have used a SWIFT code for depositing into the recipient's account. SWIFT stands for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. That is a mouthful, so it's an acronym. And so what this means for Russia is that Russia is cut off from using SWIFT to perform global transactions. And because a lot of business transactions go through SWIFT, while also a lot of personal and commercial transactions, many countries who depend on Russia imports for coal and natural gas now have no choice but to seek alternatives as a result of the SWIFT ban, right? Because money's not flowing through, so they can't continue with these transactions with Russia. And among those countries are India and China. Another piece of news I read recently is that actually Chinese buyers have stopped buying coal from Russia because they're having trouble with financing. Yeah. Okay, so what about the rest of the world that depends on Russian oil imports for energy? Well, they should rethink their energy strategy too, I think. Now, back to that interesting headline I read you in the beginning, titled, "A Shift to Clean Energy Would Halt Russia's Petrol Thuggery and More." Every time I see the word petrol thuggery, I just kind of giggle, I don't know why. So the article was actually written by a climate scientist and a professor at the University of Michigan. Actually, he's the dean of the School of Environment and Sustainability at U of Michigan, so that's kind of a big deal. No, it's a really big deal. So his perspective basically states that the less reliant we are on fossil fuels for energy, especially fossil fuel imports from other countries, the sooner we will achieve energy freedom and won't be threatened or blackmailed or worry about our supply being cut off during times of war. But of course, as a climate scientist, his main concern was climate change, right? Because fossil fuels is a main cause of greenhouse gases and also carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas. So that was tautological. Anyway, so that was baked into his argument that fossil fuels is also terrible for the planet, right? Which of course we all know and agree with, duh. But I think it's very clever of him to capitalize on the timing of the Russia-Ukraine conflict to explain the perils of fossil fuels and suggest that it's about time we shift to a world powered by clean energy. But of course, the world is not always black and white, and it's far from simple. Let's go green! Well, that's easier said than done. The transition to clean energy will not be overnight because we lack the proper infrastructure and we don't currently implement it at the scale that we would like it to be. And the vast majority of nations, including the US, still heavily depends on fossil fuels for its energy production. In the United States, 80% of its energy production comes from fossil fuels, which includes coal, oil, and natural gas. 80%. Another 12% is from renewables, and roughly 8% from nuclear. It's funny that given there's so much talk of renewables and electric cars and clean energy in the media, pushing for solar and wind and geothermal, in reality, 80% of America's energy supply still comes from fossil fuels. Ponder on that for a second. America has come a long way, but it still has a long way to go to decarbonize its energy sector. And if you think the Russia-Ukraine crisis is going to accelerate the transition to clean energy, well, not quite yet, because first of all, the US has not sanctioned against Russian oil yet. And now Biden has announced that the US and its allies together will release 60 million barrels of oil from strategic reserves to ease the soaring global gas prices. And the US alone is taking the lead on that effort, releasing 30 million from its petroleum reserves because, well, we still very much live in a fossil fuel dependent world. So when Russia leaves a void, it's paramount that we fill that void as soon as possible so businesses can continue as usual. On the other side of the hemisphere, China and India have stayed relatively quiet on the Ukraine conflict. Now, China has not yet condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it hasn't spoken out against it either, because China and Russia have a long-standing history of trade and energy partnerships, but it's not condoning the attack on Ukraine either. Well, China has kind of maintained this neutral stance. I mean, China is caught in a political quandary right now. Technically speaking, it's on good terms with Russia, but it doesn't want to upset its relations with the rest of the world that is opposing the attack, aka China's major trade partners, including the United States and many other European countries. You know, diplomacy and foreign affairs is an extremely difficult subject matter. You can't please all parties, but that's what diplomats try to do, or pretend to do. I don't know, either one of them. Anyway, so to wrap things up, I think the Russia-Ukraine conflict will speed up the global expansion of renewables as countries find new ways to establish energy security that make them less prone to political instability, but we will see if that's actually the case. That's my prediction and my hope. And of course, my heart goes out to all the people in Ukraine who are affected by this devastating conflict, and I hope that it comes to an end soon. Well, thank you fellow peacemakers for tuning into this episode, and I'll see you in the next episode.